David and Scott, could you join us at the front, please? Okay. Okay, the next item on the agenda is reports, updates, and discussions, and I'm going to turn this over to Todd.
All right. Thank you so much, Chair DeNovo. Commissioners and to our guests that have joined us here today, we've got three really stellar presentations today that are timely given where we are both in this biennium, this current fiscal year, but also with where we are in the trajectory of that 10-year strategic vision that the Commission adopted back in June of 22. And so the first update that's going to be brought to the Commission today is on our joint workforce development efforts. The Travel Oregon and the Oregon Restaurant and Lodging Association are undertaking together, sometimes in tandem, sometimes collaboratively, but always in unison. And it is my pleasure today to come up to our table here and present to the Commission our Industry Development Manager, Jamie Eder, and she's going to be joined by two great colleagues from the Oregon Restaurant and Lodging Association, Jason Brandt, who is their President and CEO. Jason, thank you for taking your time away from the Capitol and all the other things that are in front of you to be here. I know how important and near and dear to your heart this workforce development work is. I mean, you led the development of the Oregon Tourism Leadership Academy because you saw the value that would bring to the industry. So your being here today really is a testament to your commitment to this work on behalf of the travel and tourism industry. So thank you for that. And he is joined by Ella Sturdivant, and Ella is also part of doing the workforce development effort at the Oregon Restaurant and Lodging Association. So Jamie, Jason, Ella, come on up.
Hello, Commissioners. For those that don't know me, I am Jamie Eder. I'm the Industry Development Manager at Travel Oregon. In this relatively new role, I, in addition to leading Governor's Conference Planning alongside Lisa Edel, lead Education and Training and Workforce Development for Travel Oregon. I returned to Travel Oregon in May after 2 years at Visit Central Oregon, where I was the Director of Workforce Development. And it was in this role that I was able to join the board of the Oregon Hospitality Foundation and was later voted in as the vice chair. So I've witnessed firsthand the really great work being done at the foundation, which you'll hear more about in just a moment. So to start our conversation, I just wanted to take a moment to frame up the landscape of workforce development in the state of Oregon. So at the state level, you have a workforce and talent development board, and then below that, there are 9 local area workforce development and talent boards that are on the slide here. So each of these boards identifies different priority sectors, and it's very common to see like manufacturing, construction, healthcare identified. It is historically not as common to see tourism and hospitality identified. So relationship building and awareness building is key. It's been a huge win for me to also serve on the board of East Cascades Works. And in this position, I've had the ability to advocate for tourism and hospitality in this 10-county region here. And I was also able to join the Strategic Planning Committee for East Cascades Works. They did not end up identifying tourism as a priority sector, but they did note on their plan that tourism and hospitality was key as a pathway in skill building and was something that was going to be instrumental in their strategies. So attract and retain workforce development was greenlit earlier this fiscal year at Travel Oregon as a priority strategy. And some of the work done so far this fiscal year, we've been building relationships with the heads of the 9 workforce boards, led the leadership, and then we also were able to add some open-ended workforce-focused questions into the tourism industry partner survey. And the answers that we got in that survey will be instrumental in our developing strategies going forward. I also had the opportunity to lead a hospitality-focused panel presentation at the Working Together conference in October. And this is an annual conference where all of the workforce development professionals around the state gather, and it's a pretty rare opportunity to be in front of this audience, especially talking about the economic impact of tourism, but also having conversations about why our industry is so important in those larger conversations about workforce development. So attract and retain workforce will be moving forward as a strategy area in the 25-27 biennium. We will begin planning next month and really looking forward to building on the work we've done so far this fiscal year. Our partnership with the Hospitality Foundation is going to be a critical part of this work moving forward. We are nearing the end of a 3-year strategic agreement with the Hospitality Foundation, and we are looking forward to renewing this in the coming biennium and doing more wonderful work together. And to tell you more about that work is Jason and Ella.
All right. Well, we're thrilled to have Jamie Eder serving as our vice chair of the foundation. And we're so thrilled that the commission has recognized workforce development as a key strategy moving forward. We certainly see the same thing in the hospitality industry. I wanted to focus in starting with, Ella and I are going to talk about kind of 3 different verticals. How many of you are familiar with ProStart? Show of hands. Okay. So, Harish knows as a former Orla board chair, of course. Well, so ProStart is all about industry-recognized curriculum in our high schools. Now, sometimes people think ProStart is just a once-a-year event because we do a high school championship event. It's coming up middle of March, Salem Convention Center, where we have a chance to host high school kids in both a culinary and a management competition. And then those winning teams go to represent Oregon at a national competition on the East Coast. It pulls on your heartstrings. If you have a chance to join us, we'll be at the Salem Convention Center. But all of our foundation board members, including Jamie and all of the Orla staff, are actively engaged in making sure this championship happens and just pull out all the stops with a number of participating sponsors. It's a great event. That partnership is made possible because of Travel Oregon's work supporting the ProStart program. But I want to make sure you all realize that that's just a one-off annual event. It's not representative of all of the kids in high schools across this state that are participating in year-round ProStart curriculum. So we currently have 48 schools, 48 high schools throughout the state that are teaching ProStart curriculum, industry-recognized curriculum for real-world work down the road. So we feel it's really important. Of those 48 schools, just wanted to make sure you all know that at the inception of this partnership 2.5 years ago, we only had 26 participating high schools. So I did some quick math on the drive over. That's an 85% increase thanks to the work we're doing collectively. So I mean, back to Todd's point, and thank you so much for the kind comments, Mr. Davidson, really appreciate that. But through our work together and collaboratively, making sure that we're leveraging each other's strengths, we're able to see that type of outcome. 85% increase, so 26 to 48 schools with an additional 2 high schools that will be hopefully coming online for the subsequent school year next year. So again, year-round curriculum, if you're wondering how many students in those 48 schools, that represents about 7,700 students across the state that have industry-recognized ProStart curriculum so that they can pursue a job or a career in the culinary arts. So we're very, very excited about that progress, thanks to this partnership. The other thing that we were able to make happen, again, because of our work together collaboratively, is what we call the Oregon Coast Hospitality Sector Partnership. So you heard Jamie speak earlier about there being 9 local workforce boards. When we started this partnership 2.5 years ago, we had a working relationship with just one of the local workforce boards. And I don't want to steal Ella's thunder because she's really the professional behind the scenes on that front, and she does tremendous work building our relationship and making sure that tourism and hospitality have their day in the sun, so to speak. And on ProStart, I want to make sure you all know that there's an amazing professional named Courtney Smith that's running all of our ProStart programming too. So between Courtney, Ella, and then our temporary hire for this project, we had a United States Department of Labor grant to do full-fledged comprehensive research about the hospitality industry along Oregon's coastline. You might be wondering with the U.S. Department of Labor funding lever if that money is going to be taken away or if anything's changing. That's not being taken away. We've already secured all that funding, and it's already been transacted. So there could be changes to those types of programs in the future, but this project holistically has been completed, and we're moving on to kind of an implementation phase with some folks out here on the coast. But what's important about this partnership is that it gave us the chance to really showcase our industry with 3 of the 9 local workforce boards that have responsibility for workforce development along the coast. 3 local workforce boards that we didn't have a working relationship with in a really comprehensive way like we do today. So that's a huge testament to Rebecca Donnelly, who's been the temporary staff member I mentioned that's worked on this project through the federal funding. But really what set the stage for this to happen was this partnership and the ongoing collaborative work with Travel Oregon. So we're very appreciative of what we've accomplished. We did multiple focus groups, both in English and Spanish, of hospitality employees up and down the coastline. And then we also did comprehensive surveys of employers and employees. All of that culminates in some survey data and some research that is going to be submitted back to the United States Department of Labor in the form of a white paper, and that'll be submitted later this spring. But again, it can't really be overstated the importance of developing those key working relationships with these 3 local workforce boards. The Oregon Coast Visitors Association, OCVA, deserves a shout out. Marcus and his team has been very engaged in this as well. So we're very, very fortunate that we were able to secure that and really learn some important highlights and observations about both employee and employer perceptions when it comes to jobs and careers in the hospitality industry, specifically out here on the coast. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ella to talk a little bit more about kind of our overarching goals and kind of where we stand today on the overall environment for local workforce boards.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Ella Sturdivant, just to give you that again. And I am the Workforce Development Coordinator for the Oregon Hospitality Foundation. At OHF, we are working to increase hospitality presence in the workforce development space. And so, we're doing that by establishing partnerships, collaborating on projects, creating working relationships. And it is our goal to increase hospitality presence in workforce board programming and workforce development leadership. And so the Oregon Coast Hospitality Sector Partnership is a great example of 3 of our working relationships out of the 9 workforce boards. But outside of that project, I am excited to announce that Willamette Workforce Partnership has designated the hospitality industry as one of their sectors of focus, which is very significant. Yeah. We are currently collaborating with them to gather industry intelligence that will then inform initiatives for the hospitality industry within their region. Additionally, Jamie and I will be joining forces to present together in front of all 9 workforce board executives. And there we're going to be identifying points of articulation between hospitality and workforce development, and also to show the need for our industry. I also want to point out that the level of buy-in that we have achieved thus far is very significant, given that just 2 years ago, we only had 1 working relationship with 1 of the 9 boards. And one of my favorite parts about my job is that I get to travel across the state and speak to students about the hospitality industry and my professional journey in it. Just recently, I received a big stack of thank you letters from one of the high schools that I spoke to, which is a really great reminder to me of why this work is important. And since he is in the room right now, I want to give a shout out to Jeremy Strober, who is working to bring real life hospitality programming to the students of Nestucca High School. And that is the exact type of work that we are trying to support here at OHF. But outside of our work in the classroom, we are always looking to create opportunities to demonstrate the value of our industry. One of those projects being Share Your Story. And so Share Your Story is a short video series highlighting real hospitality voices in our industry. And the video that I'm about to show you all right now is the first video in that series. And it is also the first time that we are showing it publicly. So please enjoy.
My career path started as a server in McGrath's Fish House in Corvallis while going to Oregon State. I later moved to Portland, where I've worked at many different restaurants, from serving to bartending, then to general managing.
Back in 2005, when I was 17 years old, I decided to emigrate from Mexico to the United States. My first job in the United States was McDonald's. I worked for McDonald's for about 10 years, and I met my beautiful wife there. And my first responsibility was washing dishes and doing some prep work on the line. And later on, I became the PM supervisor in the kitchen.
This is me at 17 years old on my first day at Burger King. I worked for Burger King, for a great franchisee, for 28 years.
I started in 1980 working with TGI Fridays. I went to work for Garcia's Mexican restaurant, and then I went to Stanford's Restaurant and Bar, and then Oswego Grill.
Y quiero decirte que yo comencé como lavaplatos y en un pequeño tiempo de 4 años más o menos, me salió mi oportunidad de poder comprar mi propio restaurante.
I now have over 50 employees, multiple restaurants in multiple locations with a food truck and catering. I now get to provide for not only my community, but for my 50 employees and their families.
The industry of hospitality, food, beverage, travel, and lodging has provided all kinds of opportunities for my family.
When it came time for me to move on to a new career, I went to work for Papa Murphy's International. There, I oversaw many states, many stores, but I was always training. I was always teaching. I was always trying to grow leaders within the organization.
In 2006, I started a second job here at the Ocean Lodge as a housekeeper. And 2 years later, I became the supervisor in the housekeeping department.
Because of my skills that I had learned at Burger King and under the leadership of a great franchise, I was able to oversee 5 Western states. Again, my joy continued to be training, growing leaders within our organization, and with 156 employees, we have a great opportunity to create those leader positions.
Hay mucha bendición en esta industria y te quiero invitar a que vengas y compartas con nosotros, que vengas y seas parte de esta industria que está creciendo, esta industria que ofrece tanto para ti y para tu familia.
The restaurant industry has given me so much and has allowed me to grow so much as a person, but has also allowed me to support my family, my 2 kids, my 2 dogs, and my wife. You will be able to succeed as long as you have passion for what you do.
So again, hats off to Ella, Courtney, Rebecca, the Oregon Hospitality Foundation team that works in partnership with all the other staff at our association. A couple quick tidbits that might be interesting to all of you. So 2 things I'm thinking about constantly are creating these elective opportunities for our high school kids so they can understand where our industry is and what the opportunities look like. So of those 48 high schools, I just wanted you to know that there's at least one ProStart school in all of the tourism regions except for Mount Hood, Columbia Gorge. So we have some work to do to make sure that we can, bring on some ProStart schools and identify some teachers there within that tourism region that can bring that, again, industry-recognized curriculum back to those kiddos there. And then hospitality tourism management programming. So I'm going to call that HTM for short. Ella mentioned Jeremy is a great example, a local hero here in the room that has such a deep passion to bring a first pilot project to Nestucca High School kids coming up this spring, in addition to really only one other program that exists at McMinnville High School. So we have a lot of work to do to figure out how to create the hospitality tourism management programming to kind of go alongside, if you will, the ProStart programming within the high schools. So I think we can see very clearly where the opportunities are in the future, and we just deeply, deeply appreciate the ongoing partnership because there's a lot of work still yet to do.
Well, Jason, Jamie, Ella, thank you very much for the presentation. Commissioners, any questions or comments that you'd like to make at this time?
It's always so nice to see people's lives being changed. And many years ago, that one-off event that Jason mentioned, I was one of the judge on this cooking and everything. It is so much fun and they're so serious. But the main thing is it's kind of a win-win thing. They get exposure. We also get people in the business. And it's hard. Nobody in school thinks about hospitality as a career, and that's the perfect way to do it. So, thank you.
Travis.
It's kind of ironic timing because Jason actually sent an email to Rod Debin, who's our hospitality director for Seven Feathers, and we're working on, with him and his team, on participating in the ProStart program for Roseburg High School and Glide High School. So, exciting.
Yeah, that's a shout out I missed. So, but Commissioner Hill and his team, Jesse and Rod, hats off to you guys for stepping up and adopting 2 ProStart high schools by being sponsors of schools in your local community. I think that it speaks volumes, and we're really excited to actually identify more businesses because there's a lot of high schools that could use a business sponsor to walk alongside those kiddos during their year-long ProStart journey. So if you hear adopt a ProStart high school terminology, that's kind of what we're doing. Folks like Commissioner Hill stepping up and supporting those kids during that journey.
I hesitate to comment and in an effort not to sound patriarchal, but to see Ella doing this work and to realize where she is in her career doing stuff that is so meaningful and so valuable to our industry, it's really inspiring. So I just, even being here today, but especially for all the work that you do every other day, so grateful for you and what you're contributing to our industry. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from the commission? I just want to give a quick heads up, kind of shout out, reinforcing something that Jason said. The ProStart Oregon Championships are coming up on March 17th. There are opportunities to judge. I love this event. There's judging for culinary, there's judging for management, where you have the students actually come in and bring a concept restaurant to you and pitch that concept, and that's what you're actually judging them on. I usually run around with a couple of stopwatches and it serves as a timer for the students that are actually cooking on that side, because it brings me close to the teams and the students that are doing that, and it's really fun to watch them work, because what they're able to create with a couple of, basically a Coleman camp stove, I mean, is what they're using. I mean, seriously, folks, they get two butane burners. 60 minutes. Yeah, and what they're able to create is nothing short of amazing. So if you've got time on Monday, March 17th, it's in Salem, it's at the Convention Center. I guess to make it simple, I'd say let Matt know, and we'll communicate that on to the Oregon Hospitality Foundation, okay? So, and again, thank you all for the presentation today. It's such important work. Appreciate you guys. All right, Petra, Aaron, come on up. Our next update is involving a look ahead. to the 25-27 strategic plan and budget. We are in the midst of developing that for the Commission's review when we get to the Governor's Conference, and the first step in that journey is talking about a revenue forecast. And Petra is bringing that to you today, along with Aaron from Tourism Economics. Petra, as you know, is our VP of Insights and Impact and is our lead internally on the development of our strategic plan. And so we'll be bringing the presentation today. Petra, I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. So nice to be with you here in Pacific City. What a wonderful evening we had with most of you last night. So I was very fortunate that I was able to come in a night early. So like Todd said, this is a time in the biennium where we forecast the revenue for the 25-27 biennium. And you'll see a great presentation from Aaron today. And what we're asking from you is not adoption of the revenue forecast, but a concurrence that the Travel Oregon team can start planning their programs based on the revenue forecast that will be presented today. And with that, I would like to introduce Aaron Ryan. He is the Director of Industry Studies at Tourism Economics, and thank him for joining us today. I know we had a great time to visit with some of the commissioners last night at our very nice dinner at the hotel. Aaron focuses on industry-specific analysis, forecasting, and policy analysis. He has over 25 years of consulting experience applying business, financial, and economic analysis skills to support client decision-making. He assists destinations like ours and many other DMOs across the country to understand the impact of tourism. So today, Aaron will share with us information that Tourism Economics has gathered and evaluated on the U.S. economy, travel to the U.S., and of course, Oregon's revenue forecast. So we'll close with the revenue budget recommendation from Travel Oregon. Again, this is not the adoption at this time. That will happen hopefully in June at the commission meeting that we'll have later this year. And with that, take it away, Aaron.
Thanks, Petra, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sharing some time here so we can go through this material in person. So I've set up 3 sections today, looking at the U.S. economy assumptions that go into our forecast, sharing a bit about the travel sector that we're seeing, and then the third section specific to Oregon, showing how how we build up to the forecasts, making estimates about the broader lodging performance in Oregon, and then how we expect that will impact the TLT revenue. So I expect we'll have questions at the end, but if you see something about a slide that you think it's useful to clarify, also happy to respond to questions during it. So it is a pretty interesting point to be doing some of these forecasts. We're working with a lot of destinations across the country, getting a lot of questions about where do we stand in the economy, where do we stand with some of the shifting policies. So I'm sharing today the assumptions that we have at the moment going into this forecast, but yeah, information continues to evolve. So what we see, and I think a very good backdrop, is that the economy is performing solidly. So if you look at measures such as GDP growth, it's a pretty good outlook. If you look at unemployment, pretty low, so a pretty well-functioning economy at the moment. If I was here a year ago, we would have been concerned about, or assuming that we were going through a mild recession, but in the current outlook, we don't have that assumption. In making those estimates, so our tourism economics team relies on the macroeconomic team that's part of Oxford Economics. So they're looking at global economies on an ongoing basis and releasing monthly forecasts. The forecast I just showed was their February release. And the way that they're handling administration policy assumptions is that with each forecast they have a series of assumptions on topics such as tax cuts, immigration, tariffs, that they then feed into their models to assess how they expect that's going to impact the economy going forward. So this slide is an example of those impacts and what they've been building in. So to highlight a couple of the positive and negative impacts to GDP, they see 2017 personal tax cut extensions The red bars as being a pretty significant positive impact to the economy, I guess relative to a case where those don't happen. The other major effects that they've been building in are some negative effects from tariff increases, which is the light blue, and then immigration restrictions, the purple. So the immigration restrictions, they've been assuming that we don't have mass deportations, that there's a lot that happens in headlines that doesn't impact the labor market to the same degree. But that immigration restrictions would tend to slow the growth of the labor force, and with a smaller labor force, we would tend to have less economic growth nationally. So this is an example of those assumptions that they were making essentially going into the election. And I think the last couple of weeks have moved pretty quickly. There's been a lot more that's been announced sooner, faster, more I don't know the right adjective. I think we're all familiar with that situation, though. So some of the things are like tariffs, for example, in this outlook were assumed to happen later, to take time, and that's been pulled forward. So if I look at this graph, I tend to say there isn't much impact in 25, 26, but if tariffs were to happen sooner and more aggressively, then we would have negative impacts happening sooner in this type of graph. So it's a fluid, evolving picture in terms of the economy. Right now, the most current view is consistent with this outlook broadly in the sense that the team is not expecting a U.S. recession, is not expecting dramatic negative impacts from the policies, but that view could change. From a travel perspective, we've also been making assumptions about what could potentially happen to travel with some of these policies. So this is potential impacts. These are things that, we don't have enough certainty. The dust hasn't settled to a point right now that we could really impact the forecast with these items, but these are the types of things we're watching. And there's broadly 3 categories that we put on the slide with examples of less impacted travel on the left and greater impacted travel on the right. So types of things could be visa or border impediments. So if there was a reduction to border staffing, or if it was more difficult for people to get visas. Of course, that's balanced a bit by the fact that there is a pretty good stock of visas that have already been issued, and there's lots of countries that have access through visa waiver programs, so that sort of mitigates that a little bit. But any sort of disruption to border staffing could have negative impacts. Immigration. Of course, that has important workforce implications for a lot of these businesses. On this slide, we're just focused on potential impacts to travelers' decisions, and I think that could contribute to greater hesitancy of travelers if they see more restrictive immigration practices around their country of origin, or they see a lot of negative headlines that makes them concerned about traveling. You could certainly have sentiment effects there. Some people have said Mexico could be an area where personal safety and concerns about coming to the U.S. Could be an overhang on travel to the U.S. as a destination. Trade war response as well, that if we start to get into a trade war with close trading partners, Canada, Mexico, China, there could be certainly boycott type efforts or nationalist sentiment in countries that, generally it's going to be the loudest voices, right, that we hear. And there's a lot of people that are going to keep making travel decisions totally independent of the loud stuff that's catching the headlines. But I think some of that policy can result in less inbound travel to the U.S. And China is similar, that China could actually retaliate by discouraging travel to the U.S. So it's sort of a more complicated picture. So there's a lot going on here. We have not built in severe impacts into our assumptions for other clients or in this forecast. So generally what we've been working with is that there is still a strong travel recovery in inbound travel to the U.S. This graph does a good job of summarizing how we came out of the pandemic. that the dark blue line, we saw a recovery in domestic travel within the U.S. First. Then we saw that surge of outbound travel from the U.S. in the light blue, which has continued to grow. And then inbound to the U.S., right, has been the slowest to recover. They tend to be longer trips, more planning, greater uncertainty, but that continues to come back. And so our view, baseline view is about 10% growth in inbound travel each of the next 2 years. So even if that's negatively impacted by sentiment effects or other effects, I think we should keep in mind there's a pretty positive recovery story that's there. So versus a situation maybe where that was more of a flat line that already fully recovered, I think we do have a more favorable backdrop. A couple of the things that are going on in the U.S. economy as well. We've been referring to this bifurcation between high-income households and lower-income households, that higher-income households have generally been able to support their spending better than lower-income households that have been buffeted by inflation on some essential items. So as an example, if you look at spending on discretionary items, the dark blue line there, higher-income households have sort of restored or even increased that type of spending, while discretionary spending by lower-income households, discretionary like travel or replacing a vehicle or replacing durables, other entertainment, hasn't recovered quite as much. And so some of that has been inflation, that the cost of essentials has risen more substantially, so that's also suppressing that lower-income household spending. Fortunately, if you look at the discretionary spendings on things like travel, it is primarily from higher-income households that account for the majority of travel spending. So this graph is just discretionary spending in general, that the red bars are disproportionately strong in the higher income tiers to the right. So this does insulate travel a little bit, but it is still economically exposed. And just, yeah, some of the latest data, the job growth has continued, so we do see a pretty sustainable expansion underway, keeping the unemployment rate 4% or so. Inflation has come down, maybe not quite as much as the Fed would like to get down to that 2% target, but we think over time that's largely moving in the right direction. So just touching on the travel segment a little bit, so evidence of that same bifurcation among income tiers is evident if you look at the chain scales of hotels. So CoStar, STR, is a company that tracks hotel performance data. They get the data directly from the brands and the hotel operators, so it gives us a really good view of that sector. And we've tended to see more RevPAR and revenue growth in the higher tiers than in mid-scale and economy. And so some of that's likely some of the same income effects that we referenced earlier. One other thing we've been watching that's been putting some pressure on hotel performance is the growth of alternative accommodations, particularly short-term rentals and cruises. So if you look at what is total lodging nights relative to 2019, we're about 2.9% ahead of where we were. Where's that growth happening? It's happened a little bit less in traditional hotel rooms and a little bit more in those other segments. So traditional hotel rooms are still about 1% down from 2019, while we've seen about 30% growth in some of those other segments. Now those other ones are much smaller, but they have been growing pretty quickly, and so that's a little bit of a headwind on activity happening at hotels. It also means that the recovery in travel has been a little bit stronger than if we just focused on the hotel data. Recent consumer sentiment measures, we continue to see desires for leisure travel or planning leisure travel, and similar on business travel, that households, when you ask them, they expect to be making more business trips than they had previously, so those are pointing in the right direction. In terms of Travel Oregon, I'm going to do a couple pieces here, but sort of start with where we're headed. So this is the forecast table overall. So sort of providing an independent view of our forecast of TLT revenue, the level of revenue in 3 scenarios at the top, then the growth, year-to-year growth in that revenue, and then a comparison to fiscal 2019. So these are all measures that we're using as part of our reasonability checks. And so I will walk through how we built up to these numbers. If we look at a time series of the TLT revenue, of course there's some tricky aspects to it, particularly that change in the TLT rate. So the rate increase, right, shows up as a substantial increase in the revenues, and then the rate decrease tends to reduce the revenues at the same time that we're going through the pandemic. So it's a little bit more complicated set of data to work with. Recently, some pretty good trends there, though, in the revenue growth. We've been viewing the market in those 2 segments, so modeling hotel room revenue separate from short-term rental revenues, and we've started doing that because of the size of the short-term rental activity. So starting to approach a third of the activity, so we didn't want to miss that by just focusing on hotel performance alone. But when we combine those 2 and look at revenue measured by those third-party sources, STR and AirDNA, AirDNA is scraping Airbnb and VRBO websites and making an estimate of short-term rental activity based on that. So we can get the revenue information from those third-party companies to get a separate independent view of the activity that's happening in the sector that we then use in the model to see how it correlates with TLT revenue and sort of avoid having to estimate just the year-over-year TOT revenue on itself. So that summary view, this is what the TLT revenue growth looks like year to year. Some very strong growth there in 23, then slower growth in fiscal 24, and then 25 coming up to 3%, and our forecast going forward is staying in that same 3% range. We're getting there through forecasts of lodging revenue performance in that 3% range, and there's this little nuance to the data that's happening. If you look at the 5% lodging revenue growth in fiscal 2025 in the graph on the right, and you look at the 3% growth in TLT revenue on the left. And so one can ask, well, if we think lodging revenue is going to grow 5%, why wouldn't we think TLT revenue would also grow 5%? And so what's been happening is that the quarter of TLT revenue data that we just got, so the quarter ending December 24 in terms of calendar months, was weak growth on a year-over-year basis. So you can either say that's because it was weak growth, or the prior year was particularly strong, or some other nuance. But that, including that quarter in the annual number, is, because we already have that data point, is resulting in a lower growth rate than the 5%. But we think going forward that lodging revenue is going to grow about 3% in Oregon. That's when we build it up from hotel revenue and short-term rental revenue. That's what we're getting to, and we think that's a good prediction of TLT revenue. To help verify that, we tend to, in a lot of markets, look at the recovery relative to 2019. So where are we right now, and what does the forecast look like? So right now, for fiscal 24, we were about 19% ahead when you look at the lodging data, and the forecast has us going out for fiscal 2027 to be about 33% ahead of 2019. And you get to see the range of sort of an upside or a downside forecast, that there's uncertainty around the forecast range. To do that same comparison on TLT data, if we just use the raw data, it would be the black bars. So given that shape of that time series early on, it's sort of a tough comparison. We would say, boy, Oregon hasn't recovered the same way other markets have. But if you control for that TLT, statutory rate and standardize it, like hypothetically it was the same during time, you'd see the TLT revenues are about 19% ahead of where they were in 2019. So it's like, it feels like a market that, isn't a top performer in terms of recovery, but that measure is pretty reasonable, and that when we look at it going forward, we're getting up to that similar 33% increase relative to 2019 on TLT revenue. So those are the pieces going into this table. There was also a question about the baseline year-over-year growth rate. So if you look at that middle row, fiscal 24, it's the 1.4%, then 25, it goes up to 2.7, and then 26, it goes up to 3.3, and then back down to 3.2. So sort of what's going on there with why we expect things to accelerate in 26. I think the better way to really think about it is that 25 has been suppressed a bit by this one quarter of data we just got. So we would otherwise be thinking this feels more like a 5% year slowing to 3.3. But when you include that point of data and you average the other quarters, you get to 2.7. So that's why we get a little bit of this funky structure. So that's the last slide. I guess one obvious question is like, well, what is this forecast? Is it aggressive? Is it conservative? Given everything we know the last couple of weeks, I think there's more uncertainty now than a couple weeks ago or a month ago, right? So we're sort of in this uncertain environment where we don't exactly know what's going to happen. We don't know how it's going to impact inbound travel. We don't know exactly what's going to happen to domestic travel. So I think there's more uncertainty and maybe more downside risks than typical. But I think this is also generally a conservative forecast. Like we didn't start with something that's aggressive and unachievable. So I think we have that benefit going into this. And we will continue to look at this. I think Petra can help the group understand the timeline, but happy to turn it back over to you.
Two more slides.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Ryan. So what you'll see here is the revenue forecast that we wish to use in planning our 25-27 programs based on tourism economics analysis and baseline scenario. And many discussions that I've had with Kathleen, our Director of Finance, and Todd, we feel really comfortable with this, what we feel is a conservative number. So you'll see the breakdown by fiscal year for 25-26, $43,900,000, and 26-27, $45,300,000, and this is a 5.5% growth based on Travel Oregon's current budget. And again, we're not looking for adoption right now. We're just sharing with you what we would like to base our 25-27 programs and plans on. And of course, like Ryan said, we're going to be really keeping our eye on this and monitoring the forecast for final adoption and approval at the June commission meeting. So you might have some questions. I know some of you were able to talk to Ryan last night, but if you have any additional questions for him while he's here, he's a great resource for us. Please feel free to look like you might have a question.
Most of our conversation was on, the Eagles win. That's not true. It was mostly on economics. And I got that from the you're going after baseline numbers for projections for the current 25, 26, 27 proposal there. Do you remember the last biennium? Did we adopt baseline? Did we adopt the upside, downside?
I think I'll have Todd answer that, but I believe the answer is yes.
Sure. I'm happy to answer that, Commissioner Willits. We adopted a little bit of a hybrid. We looked at what I would call almost a weighting between baseline and upside, based on what we had seen in the spring of 23. So as we were going into the 23-25 biennium, that some of that growth did not materialize as anticipated, and that's what's led to this softening in our overall revenue forecast that we're addressing this current biennium.
Perfect. Thank you.
Petra and Aaron, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, we've heard about defunding of grants, and I was wondering if there's any thought as to defunding of grants for underserved or marketing or EV charging stations, how that might impact our forecast. Let's say midterm, is there any thought as how federal grant defunding in areas of our industry, in our state and our regions might impact travel?
Want me to take a stab at that? Yeah, I think there's probably different impacts for different types of programs. So I think if it's a grant for an event that's planned to happen during the year, and then the event has to be reduced or doesn't happen, right, can be very direct impacts. Some of these also sound like maybe investments that are supposed to have a return over a longer time.
Right, midterm and long term.
EV stations or other things.
Yeah,
I think would
transportation and so forth.
Right,
Yeah.
maybe the benefits of those are 5 years out rather than the next 2 years.
Midterm, long-term impacts. Yeah. Any thought or way we can predict or, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I don't have a great certainty on whether they would get canceled permanently or not.
Yeah, we had noodles at lunch, and I feel like I should throw a few in the ceiling and see. Yeah.
I don't see an upside piece of it, though, right?
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to put that out there
Yeah.
for us to think about. And, maybe there's a way we can track statewide the impact of defunding of federal grants to our industry and what that impact is for the future.
I think I just heard you say that there's been a lot of uncertainty in the last few weeks. So given that statement, I'm assuming, and I think you've already said it, that we're going to continue to look at this. And so this number hopefully won't look remarkably different in June, but potentially could look remarkably different given, just in the last few weeks, we've had so much uncertainty. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You'd mentioned the short-term rentals equates for 1/3 of that tax revenue. Now, there's some areas that are putting moratoriums on short-term rentals, or if if those short-term rentals aren't cash flowing for those investors, and then they basically sell those to the housing market, how will that impact that tax? Will they just be deferred back to lodging, or is there enough? Is there an impact on that as well?
Yeah, so that measure, that 31% is, that would be the implied share as well. I mean, it's based on the revenue estimates we have, so rather than strictly a share of TLT revenue. But yeah, I think it's the same point. Okay. Yeah, I think when areas have looked at restrictions on short-term rentals or another suggestion where if the supply gets diverted, some of the activity maybe shifts to remaining short-term rentals, some of it shifts to other lodging. So both of those, you'd sort of continue the TLT revenue. But yeah, you could lose some business to other states or to other types of spending. So that would tend to maybe reduce the TLT projection. Yeah.
Thank you.
Aaron and Petra, I also want to just add how impressed I am the work that you're doing and taking in all the many variables that impact our strategic budget. Great work today. Thank you.
I can't take all the credit. Todd and Kathleen also have a huge part in this. So.
Great job, Todd, and thank you, Kathleen.
Any other questions or comments at this time? To Petra's point, we're obviously not asking for your adoption of this. We want to but we do appreciate your concurrence that using the baseline estimate for growth, 3.3% in FY26, 3.2% in FY27 at this time is reasonable. reasonable enough for us to use as an estimate for us to plan against. And not only do we continue to monitor this, but we continue to work directly with Tourism Economics and ask them if there's a need to revise this revenue forecast by the time we get to the June meeting. So that work is done as well. So I would just ask at this time if that is the position of the commission at this time, that you are comfortable with us moving forward with these as our planning estimates for the 25-27 biennium.
Absolutely. I'm very comfortable with that. Thank you.
And I'm personally comfortable with it because we amended the outlook for this year as a baseline to start with that 3.3% growth next year. So thank you for that as well.
Yep.
All right. I apologize for the late question, but Aaron, I realize it may be outside of the scope of your work, but as we look at these, at this revenue modeling, and I consider what inflation has been and potentially could be in the near future, especially in light of increased uncertainty and downside, you don't have data to model these revenue projections relative to CPI or any other kind of inflation.
We have inflation assumptions that are going into it as well, that are sort of that inflation generally returning to 2%.
Okay. And then lastly, just looking back at your earlier slides, discussing visitor and border impediments, global trade policy, immigration policy, I'm in the uncertainty that comes with that. I'm reminded of something that we've talked about in this body at various times over the years, Mark Twain's quote that travel is fatal to prejudice, and it makes me wonder in the maybe in the near, but mid and long term, what impact prejudice could have on travel. And that, I guess, just adds to the uncertainty that makes me lose sleep.
Yeah, there's uncertainty about it. I don't think that at least the goal isn't to try to reduce travel, right? It's not, these are the side effects of things. So.
Right.
Any other questions or comments? All right. Aaron, Petra, thank you so much for the presentation. Folks, we're going to take a quick 5-minute break, and then we will reconvene at, tell you what, I'm going to make it 3:15, because I like round numbers, or at least round minutes. If we can all find our seats, we'll go ahead and reconvene.
Paging Vice Chair Willits. Vice Chair Willits to the... Still a man down.
As we make this transition to our last report and update for the commission today, I am going to call a little bit of an audible under executive privilege and give a couple of very quick shout outs. First of all, in relation to the last presentation that you just heard, you heard her name invoked a couple of different times, but it goes without saying how incredibly critical Kathleen Stewart is to the work that we do as our Director of Finance and Accounting. She, I may call her with a question, and she's like, have you checked your inbox? You know, because she's already anticipated what a question may be and has provided me with an Excel spreadsheet that probably has 3 different scenarios depending on what the answer to the question could be. That's just how Kathleen does her work, and we're very, very lucky to have her. The second is also a little bit of a go back to the presentation before that, and that's in recognition of our friend and partner and colleague, Jamie Eder. You heard her introduced as the vice chair of the Oregon Hospitality Foundation. What that means, though, is that in October of this year, she will become the chair of the Oregon Hospitality Foundation. And Jamie, I just want to congratulate you on that. So with that, commissioners, we will begin the third and the final update for this public meeting of the Oregon Tourism Commission. And it's an update on our 2020, regarding our strategic plan KPIs. As we look ahead to the 25-27 biennium, we look at the work that was done in the 10-year strategic vision. You've heard from Brian at a couple of our different meetings. Initially this fiscal year, you heard from him in September when we were talking about the KPIs and the cadence we'd want to put in place for finishing out the KPIs and setting the goals. And with that, Brian's going to bring us an update for our progress so far this fiscal year. Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Todd. Good afternoon, commissioners. My goal for today is to give everyone, as Todd just said, an update on where we are sitting with our 10-year strategic vision KPIs. But before diving into this presentation, I wanted to remind everyone about a quick quote that I pulled from our 10-year strategic vision that I think really speaks to the importance of our KPI work. And the quote is this, that no vision becomes a reality without measuring its progress. But before getting into the actual KPIs, I wanted to share a high-level shift on how we're talking about our KPIs. Previously, there were 4 distinct KPI buckets that all of the KPIs fell under. Those buckets, which you can see on the left, were different than the 4 objectives laid out in the strategic vision. This difference has led to confusion for staff and partners. So going forward, we are going to list all of our strategic vision KPIs under the 4 objectives where they already neatly align. We've also made some changes to some of the terminology that we've historically used at Travel Oregon. We've decided to replace the word stakeholder with partner due to the harmful origins of the term stakeholder. This term originally referred to those who claimed stakes in land and resources during colonization, oftentimes stealing land from indigenous communities who had stewarded the lands for thousands of years. By adopting the word partner, we aim to foster a more inclusive and a collaborative approach to our work. Not only have we updated the language and the strategies that you see here, but we've applied this change to all areas of our work at Travel Oregon. Additionally, we've streamlined our language around our Elevate the Voices of the Underserved Community strategy by removing the examples that you see here. We want all underserved communities to be heard, so it didn't feel right to highlight a few examples here. We want to continue to be aligned with the governor's office in this space. We've also made changes to the number of KPIs that we have. For our Oregon is Striving to be a place of equity KPIs, we needed to reevaluate. Going forward, the KPIs that you see here will be tracked internally. We will still monitor and measure these metrics over time. They just won't be a part of our official 10-year strategic vision KPIs. While these metrics are important, we feel that they aren't the best metrics to evaluate the success of our 10-year strategic vision. The remaining two KPIs, the remaining two equity KPIs, consisting of recording and monitoring our funding and engagement for supporting underserved and under-resourced communities, are a better gauge for success. I'll cover more detail surrounding the remaining two equity KPIs shortly. After much review, we've also adjusted our Oregon Respects Its Natural Environment KPIs. First, we added a new KPI that tracks the organization's greenhouse gas emissions. We need this number so we can be in alignment with Executive Order 20-04. This mandate directs State of Oregon agencies to take actions to reduce and regulate greenhouse gas emissions towards meeting reduction goals of at least 45% below 1990 emission levels by 2035 and at least 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Like our equity KPIs, we will record and monitor the funding and engagement supporting the development and promotion of sustainable and regenerative tourism. And finally, our last two KPIs in this space track the steps taken by Oregon's tourism industry and Oregon visitors to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and adopt sustainable and regenerative tourism practices. More to come on where we are sitting with the baselining and goal setting for these KPIs. Before getting into what's new for our baselining and goal setting, I wanted to quickly reground everyone with what we've already accomplished and covered in prior meetings. Before you are the KPIs that already have baselines set. We have KPIs under our objective that Oregon's tourism economy is flourishing, and our objective that Oregon delivers remarkable experiences. These 11 KPIs already have baselines established. Next, we have our KPIs with newly established baselines. 2 within the objective that Oregon is striving to be a place of equity, and 3 within the objective that Oregon respects its natural environment. I'll cover these baselines deeper into the presentation. All right, let's shift to here. Let's start talking about some goals. In addition to working on our KPI language and our setting of KPI baselines, the team has been hard at work establishing goals for our KPIs. These are goals for where we want these indicators to finish at the end of our 10-year strategic vision in June of 2032. You may recall from my last commission meeting that I didn't think that we'd get all the goals set by this commission meeting. I'm happy to say that since we last spoke, we have goals set now for 13 of 18 KPIs. I want to take this time to thank Deepti, the larger SRA team, and all the functional teams for their diligent and timely work over the last few months. Let's dive a little deeper into these numbers, starting with our Oregon is striving to be a place of equity KPIs. After many months meeting with teams and aggregating disparate data sources, we now have our baselines established here. However, we want to take the time to acknowledge that more intentional work is needed in this space. At the end of the day, the success of our objective that Oregon is striving to be a place of equity isn't purely about the dollars going out the door or the hours going out the door, but about the impact those dollars and hours are having with our underserved communities. Tracking the impact of this investment is a tougher nut to crack, but the team is committed to pursuing those outcomes. As a first step, we need to understand where we are today and establish the necessary baselines as best we can. Our funding for underserved communities is currently baseline at $5.2 million. This is data gathered from functional teams as well as finance and accounting. This is a baseline established on the available data that we have now. We know that there are other dollars going out the door that we can't tie directly to underserved communities. Our engagement in terms of staff hours, came in at 472 hours for program work. This data is captured via our project management tool. Once again, these baselines come from available data. We know that we aren't tracking all of the hours. There are some big gaps still present. For example, these 472 hours here do not include the work associated with the work coming out of our brand stewardship team because of the complexities of how they track their work. Over the coming biennium, we aim to improve the completeness of these baselines. And while we don't have explicit goals set in this space yet, our intent is to grow these numbers over time and ensure that these indicators are making a meaningful impact on our underserved communities. Now we're going to jump into our Oregon's tourism economy is flourishing KPIs. And now we get to talk about actual goals. In the table here, you will see our 3 economic impact KPIs with our baselines and goals. As a reminder, these are goals for where we want to be at the end of our 10-year strategic vision. So let's go a little deeper. To set the following goals, we use an exponential smoothing as our forecasting method, which means we predict future values by giving more weight to recent observations in a time series, which effectively smooths out drastic changes in data. The model also produces an upside and downside forecast to give us a range of values. Therefore, our goal is to achieve annual visitor spending in Oregon of $17.2 billion by the end of 2032, with an acceptable margin of error of 5%. In terms of growth rate, this would be a 23% growth from 2022. Using the same model for our goal for tourism workforce, our goal is 133.3 thousand jobs by June of 2032, and this represents a 15% growth from 2022. And lastly, our goal for tax revenue, which includes local, state, and federal taxes, is $2 billion, or 38% growth from 2022. Next, we'll move into our Oregon Delivers Remarkable Experiences goals. First up here are our resident sentiment goals. Here we are tracking the residents' positive and negative perceptions towards tourism in 4 categories. After looking at baseline data for the last 2 resident sentiment studies, our goal is to maintain a score of 3.1 or greater for all positive perceptions, and these positive perceptions must outweigh negative perceptions. Here's another looking at the positive perceptions from the last 2 studies. You can see here that we have historically exceeded our goal and would have some room to slide downward so long as our positive perceptions still outweigh negative perceptions, which has also historically been the case. Overall, we are scoring very well with these metrics. Next, we have a resident support for tourism development. Our goal here is to maintain a score of 1 or greater. Based on our 2024 resident sentiment study, we did not meet this goal. We need to increase by 11% to hit our target goal in 2032. Our next data update will be in 2026. Additionally, we found it helpful to look at this score by region. Here you can see that only 2 of Oregon's 7 regions have met or exceeded a score of 1 or more. Many regions, including the coast and Central Oregon, fall well below our goal. We'll need to improve these scores to move the overall statewide average up. Therefore, we are also setting an internal goal for each region to maintain a score of 0.5 or higher. Next, we have our visitor profile or visitor satisfaction scores. For visitor satisfaction, we have a goal of reaching 95% by the end of our 10-year strategic vision. For our net promoter score, our goal is to hit a score of 50 or more. And for a visitor's likelihood to return score, we've set a goal of reaching 90%. Across the board, you can see that we still have ground to cover towards reaching all of these goals. So let's dive a little deeper and look at a little more context. My team pulled data from Western states using the same methodology for tracking visitor satisfaction. But as a reminder, not all states conduct regular visitor profile studies like we do or use the same methodology. The competitive set that you see here consists of states with recent data and also using similar methodologies. This would also be the time that Kevin would like to direct your eyes to the stat that Oregon has a higher visitor satisfaction than travelers to the great state of Hawaii.
Good job, Kevin.
But in all seriousness, we don't feel that we can realistically go much higher than a 95% visitor satisfaction level, which is why we chose this as our goal. So let's move on to Net Promoter Score, where we've set a goal of reaching a score of 50 or more. As a reminder, Net Promoter Score is calculated by subtracting the score for Oregon promoters versus Oregon detractors. Research indicates that a Net Promoter Score of 50 is considered a good score, while a score of 70 or more is seen as an excellent score. Net Promoter is historically a little harder metric to move, so we have set a more conservative goal in this space. But diving a level deeper to the regional level, we can see that only 3 of Oregon's regions have met the goal of 50 or greater. The Portland region also scores significantly lower than the other regions. But if we take Portland out of the equation, our statewide score would be 49. But we can't take Portland out, which means that if all the other regions stayed the same, Portland must cover 34 points in order to get our overall statewide average to 50. And that is a big lift, and that is going to take time to grow, which reinforces the challenge that we have before us to reach a statewide score of 50. And lastly, we have our likelihood to return goal of achieving 90%. We can also compare this indicator across our available competitive set. Oregon is still scoring the highest in this grouping, with Hawaii close behind. However, we still think there is room to improve. We still think there is room to improve to 90% because Oregon isn't one to rest on its laurels. We've committed to a 10-year strategic vision, and we need to set aspirational goals to get us there. And plus, we need to give the other states someone to chase. Lastly, we have our Oregon Respects Its Natural Environment KPIs. As you previously heard, most of our work related to this objective over the last few months has involved determining what our actual KPIs are. You may recall from my last commission presentation on biennial planning that we approved a new 10-year strategic vision strategy to move into action planning for the coming biennium. This strategy, implement a tourism action plan, will be a big part of moving these KPIs forward. First up, we have our monitoring our own greenhouse gas emissions. As stated earlier, this KPI ties to Executive Order 20-04. Here, Governor Brown was nice enough to give us our own goal, but we still have work to do to establish our baseline. Our action plan team from Implement Tourism Climate Action Plan strategy will be focused on helping us establish this baseline over the coming biennium. Similar to how we are tracking our investment with underserved communities, we're also tracking our investment in supporting the development and promotion of sustainable and regenerative tourism. Much of Travel Oregon's work supports this KPI. However, as of now, we aren't directly tracking much of this work within our project management tool. While we know that there are more dollars and hours going towards this KPI, our baseline is set based on available data, which is mainly related to our Y-Guides program and our KPI work. In terms of goals, we'll work with the climate action team to establish them over the remainder of the biennium. And lastly, like our work with underserved communities, we want to eventually measure the impact of these dollars and hours. Much of the success of Travel Oregon's 10-year strategic vision relies on the partnership with the larger tourism industry. To achieve our objective that Oregon respects its natural environment, we need to monitor the steps taken by the larger industry to adopt sustainable and regenerative tourism practices. To set this baseline, we need to add a question to the next Tourism Industry Partner Survey ahead of the 27-29 biennium. This gives us a large window to further engage with the industry. And finally, we want to monitor the steps that visitors are taking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adopt sustainable and regenerative tourism practices. Using data from our 2022 visitor profile study, 79.7% of visitors to Oregon engaged in at least one sustainable or regenerative tourism practice while on their trip to Oregon. Examples of these practices include things like purchasing carbon offsets, using public transportation, using low emissions vehicles, and using a reusable water bottle, amongst many, many more practices. Over the remainder of our 10-year strategic vision, we hope to grow this percentage to 90%. So, looking at the KPIs that have goals set, we can see some areas of focus for the coming years. For our resident sentiment KPIs, we still need to improve the support for tourism development scores in Central Oregon and the coast. For our visitor profile KPIs, we need to improve all of our scores with a major emphasis on the Net Promoter Score in the Portland region. But while focusing on all of these indicators, we also need to continue maintaining progress on the KPIs in our economy, equity, and environment space. So what's next for our KPI work, and how are these KPIs being used? First, we need to continue our work establishing baselines for all the environment KPIs. We also have a few remaining goals to be set in the environment and equity KPI space as well. Second, the team is already well on their way towards launching the next visitor profile study, which should refresh some of our KPIs in 2026. Third, we need to continue building out the 10-year strategic vision KPI dashboard. And finally, our action teams are using these KPIs to build out their plans, and our functional teams will be using them for our upcoming annual planning work. With that, I'll close by reminding the Commission that these KPIs and strategy adjustments will be formally up for adoption at the June Commission meeting ahead of the next biennium. So thank you, and I will open the floor for questions.
Questions or comments for Brian? Harish.
I have a question. It sounds obvious, but I'm a little confused that when you say underserved community, is it just low income or something else? And then when you want to spend more money, what would be done for that community?
So, great question. Our definition of underserved communities and under-resourced communities is aligned with the governor's definition. They put out a definition of underserved communities. So as we're doing our work, we use that definition to help triangulate how our dollars and hours are going towards the respective communities. A lot of it is internal, so we work with our functional teams and accounting to see, like, okay, like with the grants program, for example, where did some of these dollars go? Would they qualify as a member of underserved communities? Is one example.
Brian, you and I had this conversation last night, so I know that you don't have all the answers, and you just gave us an example. But advertising, I would imagine, is not included in that $5.2 million for underserved communities. Is that correct?
Advertising is included in the $5.2 value. It's not included in the hours. So working with Michael and Wade from our brand stewardship team, we're able to get a rough number based on our target audience of how many impressions or dollars are going towards these communities based on the different target markets that we're advertising in. So it's rough, but it's an estimate of where those dollars are going.
Okay. And then I think on the fourth slide, there was a development of a racial equity plan. And so what does that look like? When realistically will that be complete? And I'm going to hold you to it, Brian.
That's a great question. So as you know, the develop a racial equity plan with Oregon Tourism Partners, if I got that correctly off the top of my head, that work is being stood up as a new strategy for the coming biennium. Okay. It's led by Lisa Edel here in the back. So we are working towards that plan right now. We aren't fully active in that space yet. I can't speak to exactly the due date of said plan. As you know, our action plans are set for 2-year cycles.
I heard
Might
2
get done
years.
in the 2
Yeah.
years, might be in the next biennium. So I'll give Lisa a little breathing room in that space to decide when that's going to be done.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Lisa's smiling, so I think you did well, Brian. So.
I just wanted to thank you and all those involved in the progress on sustainability and DEI initiatives. These KPIs are really on target, and to have, 13 out of 18 baseline goals in front of us is terrific, and look forward to seeing the other 5. And also, I wanted to compliment you, Todd, and the Travel Oregon team for also aligning with the governor's sustainable commitments through the Sustainable Board, and also the DEI initiatives through Honorable Kate Brown's focus in those initiatives statewide and moving forward. So great work there. And I know that we're looking through the regional and district offices, but also internally too. So again, great work and great progress all around. Congratulations.
Thank you, Commissioner Gremmels.
Thanks for the point. Thanks for the nod. I'm always impressed with the people in their positions at Travel Oregon. I don't think anybody else could do as great a job with explaining KPIs and their enthusiasm for KPIs. But it's every position has that same passion for their space. So thank you for being the guy in the KPI space. And congratulations on accomplishing 14 of 18. Heavy lift from where we were 2.5 months ago, saying we would love these a little quicker, no guarantees as usual, but you delivered an exceptional amount of work here. Question for you, where is this dashboard going to exist, or where are these KPIs going to exist for both internal people within the organization to see how we're tracking and external?
Thank you, Vice Chair Willits. We've been talking a lot about where this data lives and how it's going to be accessible to everyone, not only internally, but also to the public. So we have a few different thoughts on where that's going to land. It will be on the Travel Oregon industry site. How and where, we're still working on. It will be a publicly available link. It may start as just like a hard PDF. I'd like to make it an interactive dashboard, because that's fun. And then it will also be linked to in our strategic plan progress reports as well. So we're trying to get the word out as much as we can. We are going to show goals and progress towards goals in that. It won't just be a static where we're trying to go. We need to make sure that we have the indicators of where we are today as
Awesome.
well.
Thank you.
Please.
Brian, was one of the goals established lower than our current performance resident sentiment?
Yeah, resident sentiment goal was lower than our current performance based on where we are right now.
How come?
Because we're performing really, really well in that space. And I think that to set a more aggressive goal in that space would be kind of unrealistic on where we could actually grow to. We are in a really good spot right now. We are looking, that is one of the goals that we just don't have as many competitor comparisons to. The team is looking into trying to determine where we can go with other states. Not a lot of other states have resident sentiment and are tracking resident sentiment in the way that we are tracking it. So if we come up with other information that tells us that those goals aren't as great as we think they are, then we'll adjust at that time to make sure that we're in alignment.
My understanding is that Kevin is prepared to go to Hawaii and conduct his own resident sentiment survey research. It may take a couple of years.
Kevin may be skewing the data with all of his trips and negatively talking about his trips to Hawaii. So for that, Kevin, thank you.
Any other questions or comments at this time? If not, Brian, great work to you and to Deepti both. And I know others have contributed as well, but thank you. You're here today, and I appreciate it. Great presentation.
Thank you.
And with that, Chair DeNovo, I yield the floor back to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have reached the end of our agenda today, but before we adjourn, I wanted to ask commissioners, is there any additional business or announcements that you would like to make? Okay, being that there are none, I'll remind everyone that our next meeting will be on April 14th in Portland, immediately prior to the 40th annual Governor's Conference on Tourism. I said 40th annual. I know it's a big deal. Lisa and team are working really hard on that, so very exciting. More information will be posted to the industry website as soon as it's available. I'd really like to thank the staff for all of your work. Brian, the KPIs have been a real focus of the commission, and so the fact that the staff was able to really get nearly all of those for us and thoughtfully done, right? As you always do, such incredibly thoughtful work. So I really want to commend the staff for all of their work. I think that when I leave this commission, I think one of the things I will be most proud of is that as a commissioner, I got to be part of that 10-year strategic vision. And so many citizens got to be a part of that, and the staff got to be a part of that, and the industry got to be a part of that. And given the world we live in at this moment, this work becomes that much more important. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for that work. I am so incredibly proud to be an Oregonian, just traveled out of the state and was reminded how much I love Oregon. So grateful to all of you. And with that said, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you.